Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate this full house. This is amazing. This is our first event of the year. There's a couple late, Beth and Steve in the back. This is Lauren. My name is Shannon. We're part of the Free Speech Movement Educational Programs Committee here at the library. Just a little bit about what the committee is about, and then we'll introduce our distinguished panelists. Excuse me. The University Library's FSM Cafe Educational Programs Committee mission is to sponsor and present programs that are timely, informative, compelling, and that stimulate discussion on issues that matter, and that exemplify the spirit of critical engagement of Berkeley's free speech movement. Our programs are designed to engage and engender debate and discussion among students, faculty, staff, and visitors alike, like yourselves. Tonight, we have a great panel discussion about the Second Amendment in celebration of the university's commemoration of Constitution Day, which officially is tomorrow, but we managed to rally everyone for tonight, so thank you all. So we'll start with our moderator, Ms. Hannah Shearer. She's the litigation director at Giffords Law Center. Hannah joined Giffords Law Center as a staff attorney and Second Amendment specialist in June 2016, and is now the organization's litigation director. Hannah tracks and analyzes court cases involving the Second Amendment and manages Gifford Law Center's amicus brief program, in which their legal experts participate in crucial firearms litigation as friends of the court. Next, we have Professor Franklin Zimring. Franklin Zimring joined the Berkeley Law faculty in 1985 as director of the Earl Warren Legal Institute. He is the author of and co-author of several books, over 20 books, and most of his most recent titles include The City That Became Safe, New York's Lessons for Urban Crime and Its Control back in 2012, and most recently, When Police Kill in 2017. And I'll pass on to Lauren.
And next we have Professor Brian DeLay, who is an associate professor of history and here at Berkeley, and his current work concerns guns and power in the Americas. He is writing 2 books. The first explains how the international arms trade shaped the age of revolutions, and the second excavates the relationship between guns, freedom, and domination in the Americas before World War II. And finally, Professor Paul Pearson is the John Gross Professor of Political Science here at UC Berkeley. He is the author of 5 books on American and comparative politics, including most recently, American Amnesia, How the War on Government Led Us to Forget What Made America Prosper. And now I'll leave it to Hannah to get this panel going. Do you want to hold it or do you want to?
Oh, this is good. Thank you. Thanks so much to the Free Speech Movement Educational Programs Committee, and Shannon and Lauren. And thank you all for being here at this important event, which comes not only on the eve of Constitution Day, but at a moment when our country is grieving over a series of mass shootings that took many lives this summer. So I'm very happy to be here to lead this discussion, and I'm thrilled to also have our distinguished panelists. They'll be starting off the event with some individual remarks. They're each going to be speaking for about 5 to 10 minutes, and then we'll have some moderator-led questions, and then open up the floor to audience questions. So to give you a preview of the order of speakers and what they'll be addressing, first, Professor Zimring on my left. We'll open with remarks on the Supreme Court's Second Amendment framework, and he'll comment also on what courts have been doing after the landmark 2008 decision, District of Columbia versus Heller, which led to a shift in Second Amendment law. And next, Professor DeLay in the center. We'll talk about Heller's treatment of American history in the founding era, and he'll lay out reasons why, in his view, the best historical scholarship actually rebuts the Supreme Court's interpretation of history that led it to issue its Second Amendment ruling in 2008. And finally, Professor Pearson, all the way to my left, we'll talk about we'll talk about the National Rifle Association, an organization that we know has had its fair share of recent scandals. And he'll be contextualizing that organization's role in shaping politics around gun policy and how it reflects a broader shift in the Republican Party's politics more generally. So thank you all, and I'll turn it to Professor Zimring.
Okay, I understand that my assignment is to outline the entirety of Second Amendment jurisprudence in 5 to 10 minutes. And the sad point is, it's possible. The first decade of Second Amendment constitutional law in the United States has two important substantive pillars that were laid down by the court in its first decision, D.C. versus Heller, and which, while very important each in explaining all the cases that circuit courts of appeal have been deciding, are very difficult to harmonize with each other into a principled basis. D.C. versus Heller was decided in 2008. McDonald versus City of Chicago was decided 3 years later and extended to the states what had been in Heller a Second Amendment holding that involved the federal enclave. Now, what are those two inconsistent principles? The first principle is that there is a personal Second Amendment right against both federal and state governmental power for people to keep and bear firearms, including handguns. All of this is Heller. The second principle, also in the Heller opinion by Justice Scalia, is that long-standing and presumably lawful governmental restrictions on gun ownership, principally the states and often the cities as well, and on gun use, do not violate that Heller-McDonald personal right. Okay, that's it for the Supreme Court until next term. There have been a wide variety of gun control laws. What do you do when a new constitutional right has been announced like this in an area of intense caring like guns in America? There have been 1 million law cases. A wide variety of gun control laws have been upheld as consistent with that second principle. That is to say, they have a long history and presumed legitimacy. But they've been upheld by federal circuit courts of appeal, not by the Supreme Court. What the Supreme Court's been doing for a decade is ducking certiorari. They have now accepted one gun case. Now, some of the laws which have been upheld are highly restrictive in terms of who they allow and under what circumstances to own and to carry handguns. The most striking example, and the only one I'm going to give us here, was the New York Sullivan law, which was passed in 1911, which is what I would characterize as a restrictive handgun licensing system. There are, in the city of New York, over 8 million people. That's probably 5.5 million adults. There are about 20,000 handgun permits. That's less than one for every 1,000 adults in New York. So is that degree of restriction consistent with those two principles? Well, if I were a dedicated gun owner, I would think if I'm one of the 999, that whatever a personal right to handgun ownership is, it doesn't seem to include me. On the other hand, the law has been there for more than a century and would seem to be quite consistent with what the court has so far said about the kind of legitimacy of sustained historic gun control laws that would be upheld. So far, Heller and McDonald have only struck down outright bans, not restrictive licensing, saying you have to prove a need, but no one can own handguns. But the two branches of that Heller analysis just aren't consistent themes. So what's going to happen is something's going to give in this tug of war. The Supreme Court has been closely divided, 5-4 on this before. There have now been 2 turnovers of judicial appointments since then. One of them, because it was a replacement for Scalia, probably didn't affect that 5-4. The second one was a replacement of Kennedy, who was also in the majority, and may have affected that. But for those of us who are interested in how much power the states are going to have, and the cities pursuant to state authority, all I can tell you is stay tuned. It's going to be interesting, and most of the important decisions by this court on this new right have yet to be made.
Thanks so much. Professor DeLay.
Well, thank you all for coming. It's wonderful to be here with my distinguished colleagues to talk about this important question. And what I'm going to try to do is give my perspective as a historian of the Revolutionary Era on the question of what the founders intended when they crafted the Second Amendment. The Heller decision in 2008, a lot of complicated issues involved, but one of the most essential issues was an interpretation of what the founders intended by the text of that amendment. I'll just read it to you real quickly. A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. 5-4 decision. The majority and the minority both made historic claims about what was going on in the late 18th century in these conversations surrounding the crafting of the Bill of Rights and this amendment in particular. Both the majority and the minority relied upon scholars in order to make and substantiate those historical claims. Now, of course, not all scholarship is created equal. And it's worth asking, what is the best historical work on the period and on the topic specifically? What does it look like? Well, I should say from the outset that I am not a scholar specifically of the Second Amendment. I'm not a legal scholar. I'm not a constitutional scholar. I am very interested in guns in early America, and so I've read a lot of this scholarship, but I myself do not do this work. But I'm going to try to tell you what I think I've learned from this scholarship, and you can make your own decisions about this. So from my perspective, the best historical work on the constitutional era does several things. First, it considers the broad historical context of the late 18th century. It doesn't only go through databases of key legal and political documents and do keyword searches, right? This is about understanding the broad context. That's the first thing it does. Second, it integrates social and cultural history with the more familiar political and legal documents. It is attentive to the range of views that Americans held about guns around the time of the founding. And the fourth and final thing I think that the best scholarship does is that it's attentive to change over time. Right? Individual people, their views often changed from as circumstances changed, just as they do in our period, and the debate transformed over the course of the late 18th and early 19th century. So now, among scholars who do all of these things, that is to say, among scholars who understand the founding era best as historians, there is broad consensus that the Heller decision got the history wrong, that the 5-person majority did not accurately represent or understand the founding era or the crafting of the Second Amendment. These scholars conclude that the purpose of the Second Amendment was to ensure that citizens, now at the time, of course, that would have meant white men of a particular age, that citizens would be able to keep and bear those arms needed to meet their legal obligation to participate in a well-regulated militia. That, I think, is the historical consensus among the historians who understand this era best. So now let me try to unpack that and explain why. And what I'm going to try to do is tell you what I take to be the most salient bits of context that these experts would want you to know as you're trying to understand this period. Okay, so my first and most long-winded bit of context I want to share with you is about militias. There was broad agreement in revolutionary America that standing armies, that is to say, armies that are maintained by governments in peacetime, represented a threat to liberty. This was true in the obvious way, right? That governments could direct armies to oppress the people. And revolutionary Americans many of them had direct experience of this in the Revolutionary War and the Revolutionary era. But it was also true, this fear of standing armies was as inimical to liberty was also true in a subtler and I think more interesting way. And that is that, as is the case in our own time, in the 18th century, armies were really expensive. Armies also had a tendency to become more expensive and more capacious over time. They were good advocates of their own interests. And that meant that armies required states to tax significantly to be able to afford them. And to do that, states tended to engross more and more kinds of power. So the point here is that standing armies didn't merely enable states to use coercion against the people. Standing armies also produced state coercion. And that was a broadly held set of assumptions in Revolutionary era America. So, how are people supposed to provide for the common defense if standing armies are so dangerous? Well, the answer to that, according to many Americans at the time, was the well-regulated militia. These were compulsory military bodies under the direction of elected representatives of individual states, comprised of people that in their normal lives did other things than soldiering, right? But these people would be trained and prepared to act together in coordination for the common defense when need be. Britain had tried to disarm colonial militias in the early revolutionary era. And partly for this reason, once the revolution begins and even after the revolution is over, states that craft their own state constitutions often include clauses in there making it clear that the government will not have the power to disarm militia members. That's an important piece of context as well. Now, the emphasis on well-regulated in the amendment and in the discourse at the time, this was deliberate and extremely important. Militias had a mixed record in the revolution. Often they performed very poorly in the revolution. And this is a problem for people that genuinely fear standing armies, right? Because you have to have some effective means of collective defense. So for those people that most feared standing armies, and therefore were most committed to militias, they were the ones that were most zealous about the idea that these things had to be well-regulated. Because only in well-regulating them could they possibly be an adequate alternative to standing armies. So first bit of context that I wanted you to know is that militias mattered a lot to the founding generation, militarily, politically, and ideologically. Okay, another bit of context, shorter this time, I promise, is that the Second Amendment emerges out of anxieties over federalism. Really critical for us to keep that in mind when we're thinking about it. One of the reasons that nationalists believed that the Articles of Confederation, which was the governing framework that prevailed during the Revolution and immediately after the Revolution, one of the reasons that these nationalists believed that that didn't work anymore and it needed to be scrapped in favor of a new system with a strong government was precisely because these state militias seemed to be inadequate for national defense. Right? The new United States is working in a hostile world. They need some kind of an adequate military program. So these nationalists scored a very significant victory with Article 1, Section 8 of the new Constitution that they drafted, which gave the federal government the power to call out state militias. So under this new system they're proposing, state governments and the federal government are going to both have the power to call out the militia. Very significant victory for the nationalists. Now, anti-federalists, that is to say the people who were really wary of the new Constitution and thought that this could end up being a terrible idea, they worried that the federal government would eventually use this authority, the authority vested in Article 1, Section 8, to disarm the state militias. So, as with most other articles in the Bill of Rights, the Second Amendment needs to be seen as a concession from the nationalists to the anti-federalists. Right? That's the way of the nationalists saying, we understand your concerns. We don't think they're very legitimate, but we're nonetheless going to include this article to try to allay those concerns. Okay, so the Second Amendment protected state militias. I think that's indisputable. And in fact, if you read the Heller decision, the majority more or less acknowledges this. The critical question is, did it also protect the individual right to keep and bear arms, unconnected to militias? That's the sort of million-dollar question. And again, most of these scholars who I'm invoking here say no, it did not. Well, how do they know this? How can they be so sure? A few reasons. Partly, that's because the focus of debate in the press, in the Congress, at the Constitutional Convention, at the ratifying conventions in the several states, the overwhelming focus of the debate whenever guns were invoked was about the militia. It wasn't about hunting, it wasn't about self-defense, it was about the militia. That's one reason. Partly, they don't believe that it was about an individual right because a minority of American political figures and commentators in the Revolutionary era called explicitly for the inclusion of individual rights to keep and bear arms as part of the Bill of Rights and as part of state constitutions that were being crafted at the time. Almost always, they lost that argument. Occasionally they won. There's a couple states that do actually say this, but almost always they lose this argument. Partly, these scholars believe that it is a collective rather than an individual right because textual analysis makes it clear that Americans mean military service in the overwhelming majority of cases whenever they invoke the phrase bearing arms at the period. So that's another bit of evidence. And partly, these historians believe that this is about the militia and not about an individual right because the initial text of the Second Amendment, the one that passes the House of Representatives, included a conscientious objector provision tagged on at the end, making it, I think, indisputably clear that the entire idea was about the militia. I'll just read it very, very quickly. This is the one that passed the House. A well-regulated militia composed of the body of the people, being the best security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, but no one religiously scrupulous of bearing arms shall be compelled to render military service in person. I don't see how you read that and you conclude this is primarily about protecting an individual right to keep and bear arms. Okay, so to recap, the framers drafted the Second Amendment to ensure citizens would not be deprived of the weapons they needed to participate in well-regulated, government-run militias. Why then do most Americans today know virtually nothing about militias and believe, popular opinion, even before Heller, most Americans believe that the Second Amendment protects an individual right to keep and bear arms? And why did 5 of our very learned Supreme Court justices overturn more than a century of precedent and declare that the amendment protects individual rights? Well, this is what my distinguished colleague is going to be talking about.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming to talk about this very timely, very important subject. And I want to zoom out a little bit from the courthouse to think about the role that the Second Amendment plays in the Second Amendment, broadly understood, plays in our politics. And I want to do that for 3 reasons. The first is because I'm not a scholar of the Constitution, so I'd be in trouble if I tried to parse Heller or the original, the origins of the amendment. But the second reason is because I actually think the biggest constraints on gun regulation in the US are not in the courthouses, they're in legislatures, and especially the national legislature. And so that doesn't mean the Second Amendment's not relevant. And of course, the Supreme Court in the days to come might make the court even more relevant. But a lot of things that at least currently seem like they'd be constitutional under Heller have no chance of passing in Congress. Right? So we need to think about the Second Amendment more broadly, the role that it plays in our discourse, the role that it's played in fights in American politics that prevent, or that dictate the course of what happens to legislation about guns. And the third reason I think to do this is because I actually think what's going on with gun issues, Second Amendment rights in American politics is emblematic of the broader moment that we find ourselves in American politics. And so thinking a little bit about what I want to talk about, which is the role of the National Rifle Association, I think actually relates to a lot of things that are going on, particularly in the politics of the contemporary Republican Party and that way that influences what's happening out there. So, one thing that I think a lot of people puzzle about, especially if they know enough about the Heller decision to recognize that it doesn't completely limit the possibility of gun regulation, is, why doesn't common sense gun regulation happen given what you see in public opinion polls? So now, certainly universal background checks, check in at over 90% support. If you ask people about it, they have overwhelming support even among Republicans. Right? If you just ask people, do you favor that? People say yes. So this actually comes up a lot in the work that I do on American politics now. When I was being trained in graduate school, I was trained to think, public opinion is pretty powerful. What the median voter, the average voter wants is pretty powerful in politics. If something polls at 90%, you would expect it to happen. Right? So what's going on? And I think the National Rifle Association is a good way to think a little bit about what is happening and what is not happening. And some people, I think, when they think about the NRA, they think, well, it's money. The NRA pours a lot of money into politics, and money talks. And golden rule of politics is he who has the gold rules. So that explains what's going on. And I think pretty clearly that is not the case. Right? That until pretty recently, the NRA was not a particularly serious player in the political money game. I would say since 2014 or so, it has become a more significant player, but it's still not, it's not an 800-pound gorilla by any stretch of the imagination. There are bigger players around, and the amount of money that it's throwing around in elections is not enough to explain the kind of leverage that it seems to have over politicians and their willingness to, their reluctance to buck the NRA in any way. So I don't think it's that. I think actually pretty clearly what it is that the NRA can mobilize people. Right? The NRA is very good at getting people out and convincing them to reward or punish particular politicians based on their stance on the issues that the NRA cares about. Right? And that reflects less the amount of money that the NRA has. That's actually more kind of a consequence of its power than it is a cause. It's because it has really deep roots in the society of people who own guns in the United States. And that's grown over time. It's actually unclear exactly how many members of the NRA there are, but it's somewhere between 3 and 5 million people. And that's a lot of people. right? If they're really committed. Every year, a lot of people, even if they aren't NRA members, every year 750,000 people get gun training in the U.S. under the auspices of the NRA. And so the NRA is the face of the NRA that many people encounter is a face that they see in a very positive light as one that's supporting things that they care about. And of course, the NRA, including at these training sessions, is good at trying to inculcate certain messages about what folks ought to care about if they're gun owners. So they have very deep roots. They also have an apparatus that's designed to turn the dial up to 11 on these issues, or to maybe 11 doesn't quite cover it. They turn it up to 15, right? So when political scientists study groups like the NRA, NRA is actually, I think, somewhere between kind of an interest group, an organized interest, and a social movement. It has elements of both. But they say, political scientists would say, what do these groups, what are they about? What do they care about the most, right? And you might think they care about a particular issue the most. And what at least most political scientists would say is, well, actually, the ones that are really powerful, that stick around, what they care about the most is organizational maintenance, right? Maintaining the organization, right? Generating resources for the organization and keeping it going. Because even if you care about a bunch of other stuff, if you don't sustain the resources of the organization, then you don't get to do the other stuff, right? So the key to power, especially kind of durable power for these organizations, is maintaining the organization. And what maintains an organization like this is making people feel like the stakes are really, really high and that they're constantly under threat, right? So even though it has been many, many years since there has been anything, you really have to go back to the 70s, right, I think, to talk about, seriously intrusive gun regulation. It's been a long time, but the NRA is very, very good at convincing people, and in this way, it's very like a lot of what happens now in conservative media, like Fox News. It's a lot of what happens in evangelical circles as well, where the idea is like your way of life. And I think this is playing out in many, many levels in American politics. People hear messages that they find very, very frightening, that their way of life, things that they really value, are under threat, right? So, and the NRA is an enormously successful operator in terms of organizational maintenance, all right? So that makes the NRA super powerful in Republican politics. Right? And I think another element that needs to be recognized here is that for most, we can go into this more in the discussion period if people want to, but for most politicians in Congress, right, most of them are in pretty safe seats, right, at least with respect to the other party. Right? The biggest threat to them most of the time is going to be a challenge from their own party. Right? So that makes Republican voters and Republican primary voters a key constituency. And being on the wrong side of the NRA, right, is is close to a death sentence for any Republican politician in the House or the Senate. So the power that they have with Republican politicians gives them enormous leverage. Right? And in some Democratic seats, though a lot fewer than used to be the case, they have leverage. They have these intense voters who they can get out and who they can effectively signal. They have credibility with those voters to signal who are your friends, who are your enemies, who do we need to get rid of. Right? And voters respond to that, and politicians are aware of that, so they respond to it. All right, so last point, and then I'll stop on this. Sorry, just circle back to these polls that do, I think, pretty consistently show, not just in the wake of El Paso, though it's gotten stronger in the wake of El Paso, but pretty consistent finding for a long time. Most people think universal background checks would be a good thing. Right? They support it. Right? But two things to say about a poll question like that. Right? One is, it's not just people's preferences, voters' preferences that matter. It's how intensely they hold those preferences. Right? And in this case, it remains the case. The intensity is all on the side of people who are fearful of gun regulation, right? Who see it as a threat, right? They vote on these issues, right? They'll turn out in a primary and vote on these issues. And as of yet, we just don't have much evidence that that is true on the other side. That may be changing, right? But we don't have much sign of it. And so the fact that X% of the people take such a position does not mean all that much in politics unless it's something that is actually going to affect their political behavior. Right? But then the other thing to say about the polls is, even if we do want to focus on the polls, it's important not to just cherry pick the questions, right? And think that you can draw conclusions about where public opinion is based on a particular question, right? And here's a question that I think is actually much more revealing than the question about whether or not people favor universal background checks. All right, for a long time, pollsters have asked the following question: which do you think is more important? Effective gun regulation, right? Or protecting gun rights? Effective gun regulation or protecting gun rights? All right. So since 2000, if you're a Democrat, about 75% of you are going to say effective gun regulation is more important than protecting gun rights. In 2000, the majority of Republicans agreed with that. Right? It was closer to 50-50, right? But more Republican voters said effective gun regulation was more important than protecting gun rights. Right? Now, 80% of Republicans say that protecting gun rights is more important than effective gun regulation. Right? Now, that's not all because of the NRA, right? And what they've turned the meaning of the Second Amendment into, but the NRA has been a very important force for that, right? And the more important implication is the fact that when you ask people whether they favor background checks, they tell you that they do, does not really tell you what they think about the issue of guns, right? It's been pulled into, and the NRA has been an important force in doing this, it's been pulled into our increasingly polarized and tribal politics in which people characterize it as us versus them, right? And through the NRA, gun rights has been one of the important legs of the stool, right? That supports tribalism on the conservative side, that says the other side, you might in principle think that background checks were a good idea, but the people who are trying to do this are not going to stop there. Right? They won't stop until they've taken your guns away from you, right? Gun rights, protecting gun rights is more important than effective regulation. Right? So that is a big political reality. And it's part of the reason why I think, independent of what the Supreme Court decides the Second Amendment means, as important as that is, right, the politics of guns goes really deep and is now organized around these tribal lines. I mentioned when I was discussing with Hannah the event tonight, I said, we can also talk about the recent scandals around the NRA. Part of organizational maintenance, it turns out, is you get to buy a lot of fancy suits in Beverly Hills and go to classy hotels in Europe. And now that's now becoming an issue. And we could talk about this if people want to. I'll just say, I actually don't think that even if the NRA sort of ends up imploding as an organization, that it's going to have that big an effect. Because there will be other groups that are willing to pick up the mantle, and the toothpaste is out of the tube, or the genie is out of the bottle, or whatever metaphor you want to use for it. Once these views about guns and their roles in American society, Charlton Heston's idea that the Second Amendment is the first freedom, right? That's the way Charlton Heston put it, right? The Second Amendment is the first freedom. That genie is out of the bottle, right? And we've seen with the evangelicals, the organizations come and go. Once the anti-abortion movement got going, actually you could have all sorts of organizations implode in scandal. But once these kinds of ideas had been well developed within an important part of the American polity, it's really hard to get rid of them.
Thank you, Professor Pearson. I want to leave enough time for audience questions, but for now I'll ask the panel a question about the Supreme Court case that Professor Zimring mentioned. I think it'll connect the dots a little bit between the legal and historical and political perspectives that our three panelists laid out. So as was mentioned, the U.S. Supreme Court has taken a new Second Amendment case for the first time in about 10 years. And this is big news, and I think it's big news for two reasons. One is because, as Professor Zimring described, the prior rulings that they'd made were very narrow. And so what the most important Second Amendment decisions are yet to come. Because under the court's previous rulings, they left a lot of gun regulation avenues open. They talked about presumptively lawful regulations, and the court said that its ruling was not intended to disturb a lot of existing gun regulations. And the second reason is that we have a new conservative majority on the court. So the justices like Justice Kavanaugh and Justice Gorsuch, and definitely Justice Thomas as well, have been clearly signaling that they're ready to expand the court's prior rulings on the Second Amendment and maybe chip away at the limiting language that was announced in that decision and broaden the right. So one possible check on the court that might rein them in from issuing a really broad Second Amendment decision is this idea of the court's institutional legitimacy. The idea that its legitimacy could be undermined if it takes dramatic action on guns at a time when passions are really high and large-scale mass shootings are attracting the public's attention and killing more people. And as Professor Pearson's talked about, polls are showing that support for gun regulations is very high. So I'd like to get the group's views on whether and how public opinion might make a difference both in this Supreme Court case, a future case, or just in the overall landscape. Is there any way that supporters of gun regulations can kind of turn the dial up as the NRA does and really keep attention on the importance of stronger gun regulations?
Well, in the first instance, this becomes in personam politics. If you want to talk about institutional survivalists on the Supreme Court who are otherwise nominally conservatives, you are talking about Chief Justice Roberts. And maybe he can drag Kennedy. But Roberts, in the Obamacare issue, did very significantly move in exactly that direction. And part of that was institutional ambitions for the court, because after all, it is the Roberts court as far as he's concerned. And part of that may be on the merits. The part that is on the institutional province of the courts, the other thing that's true of Roberts is that he's a very strong lawyer, and he's a talented judge. That isn't going to affect his influence on Gorsuch. I think Gorsuch's mother had more impact on Gorsuch than anybody else. That could affect Kavanaugh, particularly if he has ambitions to succeed Roberts as a Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. There are a lot of people you don't want to talk to when you're talking about that institutional legitimacy. Justice Thomas, hopeless. So if you're counting to 5, pretty soon you're counting to 1 on that theme.
Professor DeLay and Professor Pearson, do you have thoughts on this issue and maybe with respect to the Heller decision from 2008? Did that decision galvanize voters, or did it have an impact on did it inspire more historical research to kind of push back on the some of the missteps that you described in the Heller opinion? Because it seems to me that that could be, looking at the Heller decision could tell us what might happen with a future Supreme Court decision as well.
Well, I would just say that definitely the Heller decision inspired a lot of historical research, for sure, into precisely the question of the founding and the intention behind the Second Amendment. But it seems to me that one thing to keep in mind with these looming cases and the potential for really dramatic change is that, again, Heller didn't really change all that much on the ground. But it's not hard to imagine a future case that makes it impossible, for example, for California or cities in California to forbid open carry. I think, if that happens, then political dynamics could shift, right? When communities feel as if the settled will of the majority in their communities are being overridden by an activist court on these cases and basically refusing to allow states and localities to govern themselves on these important questions, then I think that you could see a shift in this balance of political intensity, and that could change the dynamic.
Yeah, it's a great question. I do think Roberts is a key person, at least as long as the court's composition stays on the same as it is right now, but which of course could change. But at the moment, he's the swing justice on most of these issues, and he does care, I think, about the court's reputation. There are actually been so both on the Affordable Care Act case, and there was a report in the last few days that came out from Roberts' biographer that he also, on the Census Bureau case, had initially in private chambers had taken the position along with the other 4 conservative justices and then switched to a more mixed position at the end, just like he did in the healthcare case, which is interesting. So I think, my own, we're all, it's kind of like when people used to try to read the Politburo, right? Because there's not that much information that's public about him. I see Roberts as a very smart politician, right, who actually has an extremely conservative and ambitious agenda, but also recognizes that if the court gets too far out in front of its skis on a high-profile issue, that can be a problem, right? So, I think you're right. I don't think Heller caused them any problems, as far as I can see, and actually, played a really good role in helping to reinforce a lot of the momentum that existed on the right with respect to gun rights. But the mood around gun issues is different. It does seem like it's changing, and so I could imagine that being a consideration for him. And of course, if you are a savvy long-term politician who's trying to advance on a bunch of fronts, there are often a lot of ways that you can sort of gradually get to where you want to go, rather than make it's often not the best play on a high-profile issue to go for all of it in one stroke, right? There are often ways to get where you want to go that don't, so like the voting rights case, I think, is a great example of this, where, they gutted the Voting Rights Act, right? But they did it in such a way that it seemed like what they were doing was pretty technical, and Congress could fix it, but of course Congress wasn't going to fix it. Right? So they effectively put the Voting Rights Act out of business, right? But they did so in a way, or at least the pre-clearance part of it, right? But they did so in such a way that produced a less dramatic decision than they might have.
I want to just say one thing. If the target is John Roberts, then the question is, what kind of theme would he be most sensitive to? And the key word there is elites. He's not going to count votes, but what he is interested in is the higher end of the intellectual, social, economic, and political structure of American opinion, so that something like the corporate president's ads of this week, if you were aiming for a Roberts impact, that would be a sort of a priority path.
That's a great point, and the business community has really galvanized in recent weeks, been galvanized by mass shootings, and a lot of them have been supporting gun violence prevention policies. Walmart agreed to stop selling certain types of ammunition in its stores and prohibit open carry. So that kind of thing certainly could make a difference with somebody like Justice Roberts. And I think what Professor Pearson was saying makes a lot of sense too about the tendency to take incremental steps on an issue like this. And actually, I think the District of Columbia versus Heller decision is a good example of that as well. At the time that the court said it's unconstitutional to ban handguns, only 2 jurisdictions banned handguns. It was Washington, D.C. and Chicago. So they kind of chose the most extreme law to announce this sweeping Second Amendment ruling. So I have more questions, but I definitely want to make sure that we have time for audience questions. So let's start, and we can pass the microphone around to anyone who has questions for our panelists. Thank you.
Something which is not discussed and I think is very important is the lead levels in the blood of these shooters. I'm very curious to see what that actually is. I suspect that a great deal of what happens with the gun shooting is that people are lead poisoned. They go a little tippy-toppy and a little crazy, and then they start shooting. So one of the things we need to do is get rid of lead out of the bullets. If you take a look at what happens when a gun fires off a round, you get this big cloud of dust coming out of it. A lot of that's gunpowder, but quite a lot of that is lead. And that amount of lead, if you do it on a door, is like a $10,000 fine. So the other thing you have to do is you have to actually change the way that you have to bring back black box voting in Congress and in Senate, because right now, whatever law a rich person wants to get passed gets passed. Whatever law that we as the average person wants to get passed is about the same amount of chance of getting passed or not passed. They're at just under 50%. And that's basically the major change we need to make back in 1973. And you can see the effect of lobbying increasing over decade since then. And if you had the choice of having a black box vote so no one can actually determine how you voted, you can then take a no vote without being actually responsible for taking the no vote, particularly if you've been paid to say yes.
You know, one issue that has been brought up historically, but I didn't hear any mention of it tonight, is the question of the attitude towards the Second Amendment in terms of the militias being seen as defenders of the slave power in case the federal government in the future was not going to be able to be relied on to do that. That's one thing I'd like to hear comment on. I'd like to also throw out the question, and more generally, I think it seems to me that the defense of extreme defense of gun ownership is very much tied in with white supremacy here. And I don't have an analysis exactly of what's going on there. And another point somewhat related is the question of background checks. People talk about background checks, but they leave out the fact that there's very different kinds of background checks, some of which are, on the one hand, you can have background checks against people for their history of violence. On the other hand, you can have what some of the fake left supporting the exclusion of people on the terrorist watch list, which is a totally actually finally ruled by a court to be totally illegitimate. So are there comments on those?
Brian, do you have a response to the point about militias?
Yeah. It's true that there was a lot of anxiety in the Constitutional Convention about whether and under what circumstances the new government might be able to interfere with slavery. And this is a line of two things are true, I think, at the same time. One is that you absolutely cannot understand gun violence in the United States and our gun politics in the United States without accounting for white supremacy. You know, I mean, Republican Party in the Republican Congressional Caucus is something like 93% white, and yet gun violence in this country massively disproportionately afflicts people of color. So a black child in this country is like 10 times more likely to lose their life to gun violence than a white or an Asian child. So, and there's a million metrics like that. So I think it is indisputably true that white supremacy has to be part of the analysis of understanding the predicament that we find ourselves in this country with guns. But it's also true that I think it's too easy to take that reality and then port it back to the late 18th century, because frankly, I don't think most of those Southern delegates to the Constitutional Convention really were that worried about the possibility that white supremacy could be systematically disrupted, or that they would lose their ability to hold human beings as property. So I think that can be overdone. And it's also true that militias, one way to gauge the seriousness with which states held the militia project is how many guns they had. And the northern militias were vastly better armed than the southern militias. So I don't actually think that the militias figure into anxieties over slavery all that prominently.
Thank you. I also think there's different patterns of what's called of regional regulation with firearms, and some of it cuts the other way. I think with regulations on the public carry of firearms, in the post-Civil War period, northern states had much tighter regulations, and then states that had many freed slaves, politicians supported kind of relaxing those regulations and really pushing this idea of self-defense by wealthy whites. So there's other patterns like that, and it complicates the story a little bit. I know you also talked about background checks and the idea that there's different levels of background checks. I think it's significant that when we talk about the polls showing that 90% of people support gun background checks, that's really talking about just closing a loophole in federal law that enables people to buy a gun without a background check in a private sale. And the definition of what's a private sale, it means that a lot of people can fall into that loophole. And so I think it's really it goes to what Professor Pearson was talking about, that it's really shocking at some level that 90% of people support this really basic policy, but it still doesn't go anywhere. So I think we are a long way politically from anything more than that.
Hi, really enjoyed the discussion so far. I have a question about changes in technology. States can pass all sorts of gun regulations like licensing, registration, and solvents bans, but they're only good if they can be enforced. How should legislatures respond to advancements in technology like the development of so-called ghost guns, the advancements in 3D printing technology that allows people to 3D print AR-15s and pistols at home? Thank you.
You already have a microphone. You can go for it, or you can.
Well, first of all, I want to tell a terrible technology story on myself. And that is, I want to disagree with one thing that you said about the Heller majority opinion, and that was that the inclusion of handguns was based on a historical claim. It wasn't, and the reason it wasn't had to do with the difference between what was published at the time that the Circuit Court of D.C. had extended a right to bear arms in Heller, and that was based on handguns being in 1794, according to the judge writing the opinion, an important part of armament in militias. I ran out immediately and published an article with pictures of what he was talking about as a handgun. Mae West would certainly have appreciated it. It was about 15 inches long and not concealable. And very obviously what the 1911 Sullivan Act was about. Well, that's fine. So you win that point, and the point is that when you then get to the majority opinion in Heller, what Justice Scalia says is, and we include guns because citizens want guns, full stop. So that's there. Lots of the technology stuff would be very important if we had more effective restrictions. They'd be a wonderful way to beat them. But we have about 125 million handguns in circulation now. So the fact that what you can do with computers is increasingly likely to be making pretty good weapons is only going to become important when there's genuine scarcity on the other kinds of environments. It is always possible for sophisticated people to cheat on any kinds of technical frameworks. So if you take the Las Vegas shooter for a moment, and you were asking what kind of widely supported legislation would have limited his capacity to inflict damage in that shooting, I don't know of anything that would have. On the other hand, if you take almost any other of the shooters, the wonderful thing, or the less horrible thing about most mass shooting is that so far it has been very substantially an amateur operation, very unskilled and very self-destructive, so that if our only danger were technologists, we'd be living in a much safer country.
Hi, I was wondering if you thought that with the rise of students, like the March for Our Lives and other similar things of student activism for gun regulation, if that's actually impacting Congress and the beliefs of the congressmen as well as the court.
Yeah, it's too soon to tell. I mean, again, what is going to have to be demonstrated is that people are going to vote based on this at a minimum. You know, and I have to say, I wanted to just say something about this issue about money and politics before, because I very much believe that the growth of economic inequality and the way that has produced enormous increases in the inequality of political money has had a huge effect on our politics. I don't think you see that directly in the politics around guns. I think you see it indirectly, because I'm actually working on a book with Jacob Hacker about this, in which we argue that the Republican Party's alliance with super wealthy and big corporations has basically forced the party to make more and more aggressive, intensive, non-economic appeals in order to hold its political coalition together. So I think inequality plays in that way. But it's clear that there's a social movement on the right around gun rights that is mostly not about money and has been very, very effective because it actually delivers votes, right, with respect to this issue. And it has, and so, you know, the public mood seems to have changed, but we don't yet know that works the other way. And it could actually work through two different channels, and I think both of them are plausible, right? One is it can work through suburban whites, and in particular, suburban white women and non-college educated women who have been voting for the Republican Party, but now, in part because of gun issues, are having their doubts, right? And the other place it could potentially show up would be through youth turnout, right? If every age group in the United States voted at the same rates, our politics would be unrecognizable, right? But there are a lot of people who click likes, right? But who don't vote, right? And so, you know, so that would have to be the channel. So, you know, either I think through white suburban women in particular, which is a constituency that Republicans were in a really strong position with pre-Trump, but it's clearly shaky. You saw that in the 2018 election. Or with younger voters, you know, if they actually turn out and vote, and if guns becomes an issue that is going to bring them out to vote, that would have a big effect.
I have a related question about guns in schools. I've read an estimate that there may be 200,000 American students who have been present during a school shooting. It's clear it's had a horrific impact on the kids in schools today. They call themselves the lockdown generation. And there's ample evidence that it's contributed to you know, significant depression among kids as they think about their schools as unsafe places. So I'm wondering what you might suggest from a legislative, a legal, policy point of view that could be done to help ensure the safety of our kids in our schools. There's 60 million Americans every day in K-12 schools, students and employees. So it's a huge constituency.
From the standpoint of safety instead of a feeling of security, my instinct in terms of school security is less is more. That the more focused on attempts to respond to this extremely low frequency event that is not only low frequency but very difficult to respond to in an effective way except by outside folks, the costs probably greatly outweigh the benefits. What we did during the last two panics in American schools, the first panic was on youth homicide from about 1986 through about 1994, and that was put cops in schools. There's no evidence that it made schools safer. There is evidence that it made them governable in different ways that I think were problematic. Then came a whole mini epidemic of school shootings that in terms of numbers, but most of these were kids bringing guns. It started about 1996 and culminated with Columbine in 1999. That had a fabulous impact negatively on making school safety a worry, mostly for adults rather than kids. It abated simply when school shootings went down, and those were the school shootings. That wasn't the sort of situation that happened in Sandy Hook. And what we're now talking about as school shooting threats are very different than the kids being the shooters. They're essentially invasions. And again, if there is anything that really makes schools safer there, other than communication to outside responses, I don't know what it is. And it is such a low-level event that it would be fabulously expensive. And not only expensive in terms of public money being invested, but also in terms of the authority of teachers and school administrators to control school policy instead of a security apparatus making its own rules. So unless things get horribly worse, I just couldn't be enthusiastic about steps toward making schools deliberate security environments.
Thank you so much for the great discussion tonight. I had a question. I have heard a lot of discussion on various school shootings and issues about gun regulation, but I haven't heard much about this argument that many people make that the need for a gun is necessary in order to defend one's family or for personal protection. And I'm just wondering, there's been, we've heard from statements from the NRA saying that the only way to stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. And I'm wondering, is it possible at this point in time with so many guns in circulation for there to be effective gun control, that perhaps even with measures as far as we can go, there's still ways that entities or people can access those guns and cause harm to others? Thanks.
Well, there are two separate questions there. One of them is there any density of gun ownership by any defined class of people that makes a state or a city or a community safer? And we haven't found any, and there's been a lot of research on that. And generally what happens is that the death rate from assault goes up with gun density and gun ownership density. It's not the only feature there. That said, when you have something on the order of 280 million guns out there already, is there any way that you can affect gun availability for people that want to misuse them? A little bit, yes. And indeed, we've been living through a miraculous time in the United States because as particularly during the Obama administration, handgun purchases and gun ownership rates kept going up, the homicide rate stayed extremely low, and if anything, got a little bit lower. What happened to this notion of gun availability and gun use and violence then? What happened was very interesting, and that is that there were two different trends in gun ownership in the United States that were taking place at the same time. The number of guns out there was increasing tremendously, and the percentage of households that owned guns was dropping significantly. And it turns out that if what you're worried about is the use of guns in interpersonal violence, it's the first gun in your house, not the 12th, that is going to be the risk determiner. Partly this has been because of the increase in female-headed households, and gender is a phenomenal predictor on gun ownership. But partly what it has been is that the people who are gun owners respond particularly to those kinds of fears by creating huge stockpiles. Now, the great thing from a criminological perspective about that was that these were mostly older white males. And they have very low interpersonal violence rates, with the exception, by the way, of mass shootings we're finding out, and that's been something of a problem. But as bad as things have been in the United States, if gun ownership as a proportional population impact had kept up with the density of guns out in society, we'd be in much worse shape.
I just wanted to ask a related question of Professor DeLay and Professor Pearson, which is that this notion that only guns can keep you safe is a National Rifle Association talking point, but it's actually evolved over time. So I think as certainly decades ago, in the middle of the last century, maybe as late as the 70s or 80s, the NRA didn't support the idea that everybody should carry a concealed gun in public. The NRA president supported restrictions on public concealed carry, and now it's a different story. They support concealed carry with no permit at all, no background check, no qualifications, and so they've really evolved their stance on the idea that only guns can keep you safe in public spaces. So I was wondering if Professor DeLay or Professor Pearson could talk about how the NRA has used that view and how it's maybe played into the interpretation of the Second Amendment that they've supported, or just how they've affected American politics with that idea.
I'll just say something that actually piggybacks on something that you said a moment ago about NRA training. So one of the things that I think people that aren't part of the NRA often don't realize is this degree to which the NRA manages to insert itself in American gun culture, whether gun owners want to associate with the NRA or not. So there are a lot of, for example, shooting ranges around the country where one must be an NRA member in order to use those facilities. That's one example. We had a remarkable PhD student in sociology here, Jennifer Carlson, who is now a professor and has written a really phenomenal book about the culture of NRA political activity and the sort of culture of concealed carry in Michigan, right? Is that what it in Michigan? Yeah. And so one of the remarkable things that Jennifer did when she was doing her research is that she got certified to perform NRA training for people that were seeking these licenses. And something like 10 or 15% of the time and the energy that's spent in those NRA structured programs has anything to do with the mechanics of actually shooting a gun, caring for a gun, gun safety. Something like 85% of it was ideological, about you have to be prepared to defend your family and your community. You have to be prepared to kill someone. You are going to be the thing that the person that's going to stand between your community and unthinkable violence and criminal behavior. So I think that partly the struggle is wrapping our minds around the phenomenal success that the NRA has enjoyed over the past generation or more in transforming what, as late as the 1970s was basically like a sporting rights organization that occasionally got involved in political activity into something that is just so multifaceted and hugely influential, far beyond the political donations that it makes.
If anybody's seen American Sniper, which I regret that I did, there's a scene where he's, I think, talking to his kids, and he's talking about how there are sheep, and there are wolves, and there are sheepdogs, right? And you're supposed to be, the thing to be. You don't want to be a sheep, and you shouldn't be a wolf because that's bad. You should be a sheepdog, which means you got to protect the sheep, right? And that's Jennifer talks in her book about that as being the kind of culture of guns that's being inculcated, and it is a huge shift. Right? This was a sporting organization. There's actually a fascinating story about there was essentially war within the NRA in the mid-1970s. They were getting ready to move their headquarters to Colorado just to reinforce the idea that this was a well, they would have said sportsman, I'm sure, or organization. It was about hunting, right, and marksmanship. Right, and there was essentially, it was kind of Game of Thrones kind of month at the NRA, and the people who had made this plan got overthrown by a group who were much more political and turned it into this political organization. And then it shifts from being about hunting, and you can see this in public opinion surveys over time, that people start to give more as a rationalization that it's about protecting their family, right? It's about crime, even though the crime rate is falling. When this shift in public opinion is taking place. And more recently, and I think actually even more alarmingly, there's this shift to the idea that it's about protecting yourself from the government, right? Because they're going to come and they're going to take your gun away, right? And you can see this in a lot of the rhetoric that's going on. But all of this is of a piece with a lot of things. That's why I said, like, the issues that we see with guns are related to a lot of things that are going on in American politics more broadly, where there is the mobilization of fear, right? And the mobilization of a sense of threat. It's very connected to race. It's very connected to the huge demographic transition that the US is undergoing right now. There's a lot of ugly history, both in the US and other countries, about what can happen to the politics of a country when these kinds of demographic transitions are taking place, and when people see an upside in mobilizing people to be fearful about it.
Can I just add one very quick thing we haven't talked about, and that's business. This is, in addition to being a deeply felt political commitment and a culture, it's also a business. And the only a good guy with a gun can stop a bad guy with a gun tagline, that was the product of an ad agency, of an incredibly potent ad agency, right? That's worked with the NRA for a very long time and now is having a very messy divorce with the NRA. But those people came up with that not for some deep-seated love of liberty, but because they're a paid ad agency. The gun makers in this country profit handsomely through the inculcation of this idea that you better get them while you can. The government's coming for your guns. So, you can see this in the elections. Like, the best thing that can possibly happen to the arms industry in the United States is to have a Democratic Congress and a Democratic president. It just goes off the charts. And as soon as Trump was, everyone in the arms industry, they also expected Hillary Clinton to win, and they were gearing up for more boom times. And it was just an absolute bloodbath as soon as Trump won, because all of a sudden the main commercial driver for the massive expansion of the number of guns in this country collapsed. So business plays a really important role in this whole thing too.
Leaving aside the history of the Second Amendment, what do you think the practical determinants of the debate on gun rights, or lack thereof, should be? In other words, besides the Second Amendment, why should or should we not have the right to individual gun ownership? Furthermore, if there are to be restrictions on private gun ownership, how should we determine their limits and methods of enforcement?
It turns out that the major focus for dividing policy between restrictive and permissive ownership frames is what kind of gun we're talking about. Putting aside for a moment the AR-15, nobody has ever attempted in an American context, nor would they, the restrictive control of long guns. About half of all American households own rifles or shotguns. That's more in the country than in the cities. And it would be unthinkable to even attempt restrictions there. It also turns out to be very important if what you're worried about is interpersonal violence, and particularly crime, that handguns, because they are concealable, and because they can come with you and not announce that you have them, are the overwhelming crime guns in the United States, the overwhelming threat to police officers, where 97.5% of all assaults against police officers that kill are guns, and the vast majority of those are concealed weapons because the officer doesn't know it's coming. So it's a kind of gun policy, and that means that the question, as broadly as you asked it, has never been important and probably won't be important in the United States at any time. The question is whether higher risk weapons can be selectively made scarce. That's getting tougher and tougher as well, not only for political reasons, but because of the population of guns that are out there. That's probably not hopeless, but that's a long-range proposal. The other is just off the charts. And there are advanced, developed countries in the world of 2019 where shotguns and rifles are fairly restrictively governed. Australia is heading in that direction. Canada isn't. I'd be much more interested in whether we could catch up with the Canadians than whether we'd ever pass them as a country. And that isn't even an issue of the NRA. That's an issue of the character of American government and society, and in a plural environment that we probably want to encourage.
Thank you. I think that's a great question to close on, and we're up at our time of 7:30. So thank you all so much for being here, and thanks very much to our panelists.